so different. I'm not at my desk. But yeah, Q&A as per, and then if you pick anything up on the go, then that's always good. Just ask away when you have got any cues. I don't know why I'm being so quiet. A topic I had in mind was exercise selection and execution and its importance. So obviously, selection and order is going to be obviously dependent on what you want to achieve. So obviously, if you're such a focus on growing muscle, the general consensus of putting more stress through the muscle over time is going to be a major factor. Morning, Jack. But yeah, in terms of if you're picking exercises for a certain goal, are you looking at them in terms of a standpoint of, is it going to be a practical approach? So if you're doing squats near the end of a session or the start of a session, obviously how much fatigue you have from the session itself is going to be very different. So I think the factor of just considering what your warm-up is and your first couple of exercises and then making the rest up as you go is quite conflicting in terms of progressions. So in terms of saying, if I was doing hack squat and hip thrusts, but then obviously because they are such demanding exercises, I'm going to need to go into an exercise first to warm up. So in that respect, I would only go into, say, a cycle for about 5 minutes and then probably either leg curls or leg extensions, pure just to warm up the knees. I wouldn't go in terms of trying to grab a stimulus and get blood flow through the legs itself. It's just purely for me getting into a good place to start the main bulk of my session. So in terms of saying a compound to an isolated exercise, a compound is basically when it's going to be hitting multiple joints and multiple muscle groups at the same time. An isolation will be a single muscle, single joint. So in terms of that, you could say a squat, it's going to be heavily a compound in comparison to something, say, a leg extension, because it's just flexion and extension of the knee, and a bicep curl, flexion and extension at the elbow to cause the contraction at the bicep. So it's all dependent on where you find the use for each exercise, and then obviously picking exercises as well that you might not necessarily pick up. So implementing, say, a core activation and engagement exercise prior to, say, doing RDLs or a deadlift move, so you don't forget how to brace. So I think a lot of people tend to forget how to physically brace through a movement and actually get into a good position. So with an RDL, you'll typically, bloody hell, you'll get a lot of people that will, obviously, you bend at the hip, like that. But a lot of people, when the weight comes, and obviously as the weight comes further away from the body, it's going to get heavier to the actual body itself. Because if you stand like that with the bar, you're going to last a lot longer than if you're standing like that, because obviously the force of pull of the weight is going to be coming down here and not in line with your body. So when you get to here, your body will, a lot of people tend to curve. This is because they're forgetting to brace and they're actually forgetting the physical concept of that, how the exercise happened. So it's important to realise that this, as an RDL, needs to stay as two solid movements. Because if you forget and start the curve, going to cause a back injury, and then also just neglect the actual movement. Because if I was pivoting like that, I'm not going to put the emphasis on pushing my hips back and putting the stress through my hamstrings, which is the main concept of the movement. But I'm going to be putting it through my lower back. I'm basically just doing back extensions, which they have their own independent place, and especially if you're putting a load on like an RDL or a deadlift, which can go quite aggressive, heavy, it's going to be very different. So it's conflicting and making sure that you're picking everything correctly, but then also you're picking it correctly to what you need for the day. So dead bugs prior to doing heavy loading exercises like that, I think are pretty key. depending on obviously where you are within the exercise, if I said that to say, let me think, rack pull. So obviously a rack pull's not going to be going through that full range of motion, but you still need to make sure that you've got the emphasis of drilling your hips forward through the motion to make sure that you are getting that lockout correctly and not putting the stress on your lower back and causing that little curve at the top near your rhomboids, because it's going to cause an injury, especially with the load that you will generally put through with a rack pull. Yeah. So I think this is why an important factor for a lot of people is actually getting a coach, because it's not just having exercises, it's knowing when to implement them, how often to implement them, and are you getting the work in around the exercises to make sure that you're ready to do the moves. Because getting injured, especially when you're doing something with a heavy load, can set you back, and setting yourself back after all this time off is probably going to be the most gutting feeling that you can get during lockdown, and none of us want that. But yeah. What was the other one I was going to discuss? Execution. So I think I've covered this in a live before, but execution in terms of saying you need to get into a certain habit of movement before you start a loading position, because I said this at work to someone the other day. If you can only squat to a certain position, which only lengthens the hamstrings to about half their capacity, and then you went into a loaded position and then went further than that because the passive range of motion has pushed you past that point, 9 times out of 10 you're probably going to cause an injury. So in terms of saying you need to prepare yourself first before even loading and making sure that all muscles can go through the full range of motion, pretty standard procedure. So that's in terms of everything. So shoulder press, squat, bench press, everything, even your lats. So understanding how your body works now and how it doesn't. Like, I had a mini assessment last night and went over stuff, and I have a fair bit wrong in terms of I've got my right trap is overactive and my left lat is overactive. So I've got like this cross section across my body, and then literally no activation the other side, so that's where the tension's coming and it's restricting in terms of like movement. But then I'm also having issues in other aspects. So I've got internal rotation of the knee, so that's causing my knees to like go inwards, and then that's causing the weight, obviously because my weight is further central, so closer to my body, it's causing my feet to also roll in ever so slightly. So it all links, and making sure that you can see where it links is a really important factor, and making sure that you aren't screwing yourself up in terms of saying, if I went and loaded that movement now, especially for something that could cause an injury like that, in terms of could my knees buckle in? Potentially. So I need to make sure I've got the movement and the execution right at a lighter load before I start going in and saying, okay, this is what could happen, and this is going to cause an issue in terms of injury and performance later on and down the line. So if you're trying to make sure that this is a habit and you're sticking to it long term, you need to make sure that you're nailing it down first and then going over it in the future to make sure that execution is just spot on. Because there's nothing worse than loading it, realising there's an issue, and then having to go back, make sure it's correct, and then just go back again. For me anyway. I know a lot of people... Okay, sorry. They have certain movement patterns which are genetic and hereditary, and then you've also got people that are hypermobile, so it's going to be a bit different for them. But I think because they are so, that's what I'm after, say flaccid, the ligaments basically are in an extended state, they're at more chance of getting injured, which is the weirdest thing. you'd think being hypermobile would be a lot better, but no, it makes you more susceptible to actually being injured. I've been going for like 11 minutes, but no one has popped in, so I am probably going to leave it there.